There are several types of arguments we'll come across again and again in this bioethics module. It is not natural type of argument, it's disgusting type of argument, it's too risky, and it's a matter of opinion. These arguments are intuitively attractive. They often occur in discussions about ethics in the media, and they almost certainly pop up in our own ethical thinking. The aim of this lecture is to make you question some of the things you might believe to be obviously true, among them being the relevance of these types of arguments for bioethical discussions. Let's start with the first argument type. It is not natural. The core of this argument is that some action is not morally acceptable because it is not natural. We should be careful because the term unnatural or not natural has many associated meanings, and they will give different forms to the it's not natural type of argument. For example, the term can be taken to mean artificial or man-made or violating the laws of nature. If we focus on any of these meanings, it doesn't seem to be either necessary or sufficient for some things being immoral that it should also be unnatural. To undermine this necessary and sufficient type of condition of this argument in link to the morality or immorality of an action, consider the following observations. There are natural things like earthquakes or cannibalism that might be deemed immoral, as well as there are things that might be deemed unnatural, like vaccinations, that are morally acceptable. There are a series of bioethical issues where the it's not natural argument is often invoked. When one writes or thinks about the cloning of human beings, some people argue that it should be morally unacceptable because it is not natural. Also, older women having babies is thought to be morally impermissible because it is not natural. Similarly, genetically engineering crops or growing human organs or transplanting pig organs into humans are bioethical questions where the it's not natural argument has been used. The second type of argument often encountered in bioethical debate is it's disgusting type of argument. The core of this argument is that some action is not morally acceptable because it is disgusting. Many people tend to agree that our intuitions play a large role in our decisions about whether something is or isn't morally acceptable. This type of argument seems to rely heavily on the use of our intuitions. So, according to these arguments, because we feel that something is wrong, and in this case disgusting, we decide it is indeed morally wrong to do it. Or perhaps because we do not feel that something is wrong, that we decide it must be morally acceptable. Intuition is important to both philosophy and science. We rely on intuition when we sense that an argument is good or bad, a claim true or false, or a hypothesis reasonable. It is our intuition at work when as we read something, we think rubbish, or that's true. Oh, I see that. To be capable of exercising reason is partly to be equipped with such intuitions. But one problem with intuition is that often they are grounded in ignorance. While it is understandable for people to recoil from things they know nothing about because the unknown is often frightening, such intuitive recoils are not well grounded. The only way to discover whether our intuitive fears are well grounded is to subject them to rational scrutiny. To subject our intuition to rational scrutiny is to try to pin them down. We need to be able to recognize an intuition for what it is, find out why we hold it, if we can, and then ask ourselves whether our reason for holding it is or isn't a good one. Although we rely on our intuitions to alert us to arguments and to problems with arguments, these intuitions should be pinned down by rational argument. We should not think of them as being the final word. So this is the strategy that should keep us safe from abuses of the argument "it's disgusting" in order to motivate the moral acceptability or impermissibility of some action. A couple of examples of bioethical issues where the "it's disgusting" type of argument is invoked. Again, thinking about cloning of human beings. Some people will say that it is immoral because it produces in them this disgust reaction. Also, using eggs from aborted fetuses or for IVF is considered to be immoral by some because it generates the disgust reaction. Similarly, thinking of eating in vitro meat or transplanting organs from non-humans into humans, or even experimenting on non-human animals. The next type of argument that is often encountered in bioethical discussions invokes the notion of risk. So the core of this argument is that if something is risky, it shouldn't be morally permissible. Consider an example to get your intuitions going. Say we discover a drug that cures the common cold. Should it be licensed? If we think of the misery prevented and the working days being saved, we will surely say yes. But some argue that we must temper this excitement with caution. What about the risk associated with the new drugs? Shouldn't they bear some weight in our decision making, in our judgment that something is morally acceptable? Quite recently, the international community has been changing its attitude towards risk assessment from a traditional approach to a so-called precautionary risk assessment approach. So what the traditional risk assessment approach said was saying that licensing an innovation is permissible unless there is evidence of unacceptable risk. The newer precautionary risk assessment approach says that one shouldn't license an innovation unless there is evidence of no unacceptable risk. So, the precautionary principle says that when an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. The shift to the precautionary approach is sometimes characterized as a shift in a burden of proof. So before, on the traditional risk assessment approach, the burden of proof fell on those who didn't want the innovation licensed. They were the ones that had to demonstrate positive reason to believe in an unacceptable risk. Now, with the precautionary risk assessment approach, the burden of proof falls on those who do want the innovation licensed. So the pharma companies, they have to demonstrate positive reason to believe there isn't an unacceptable risk. But in terms of how they guide our practice, the traditional and the precautionary approaches to risk assessment tend to converge. If licensing requirements are strengthened, the traditional model will identify more risks and look more like the precautionary model. On the other hand, if we unpack the precautionary principle or model, so we know which risks we must rule out, it will look more like the traditional model. So the differences between the two approaches to risk assessment are less dramatic than they originally seem. Because no evidence of risk despite rigorous testing is very much like evidence of no risk. So we might even think that it is as near to evidence of no risk as we can realistically get. What are the sort of bioethical issues where it's risky type of argument is being invoked? For instance, considering whether one should allow children to be born to drug addicts, or whether one should allow the government to set up universal DNA databases. In debates about allowing the free publication of security-sensitive experiments, the "it's risky" type of argument is invoked to motivate the immorality or the moral impermissibility of this action, as well as in debates about creating organisms unknown in nature and genetically engineering crops or food. Finally, the last common type of argument that one encounters in bioethical discussions is invoking this idea that morality is always a matter of opinion. So the core of this type of argument is that something is morally acceptable or forbidden because someone believes it to be so. This relates to a common point in discussions of ethics, namely the point that there is no use in objecting to something because morality matters are matters of personal opinion. Now, this argument that says that the moral character of something depends on a people believing it assumes that moral statements are comparable to statements of personal preference. But are statements of moral belief comparable with statements of moral preference? Compare Sam believes that attacking elderly ladies is morally acceptable to Sam believes that pink flowers are ugly. Where do your intuitions lie? Are the two types of sentences similar? Many people make the mistake of treating the two types of the beliefs as being the same. The mistake relies on the failure to distinguish between first-order statements, such as it is morally acceptable to attack elderly ladies, pink flowers are ugly, from second-order statements, like Sam believes that so and so. First-order statements and second-order statements are made true by different kinds of facts. This is why one can say that there is more moral judgment making than believing that something is one way or another. So what makes the statement attacking elderly ladies is morally acceptable true is different from the fact that makes the statement Sam believes that attacking elderly ladies is morally acceptable. Because we have this difference, we cannot support the idea that what makes something moral or morally acceptable is a person believing it. Where does one find appeals to this type of argument in bioethics? When people argue about the right to have a child, or the duty of a state of funding certain type of interventions that make possible having a child, this type of argument is often encountered. Also, when you think about the legalization of assisted suicide or euthanasia, there are appeals to this type of argument. So, it's not natural, it's disgusting, it's risky, and it's a matter of opinion are some of the most common arguments encountered in bioethics. But despite their commonality, we can question each one of them. So we can question whether the fact that something is not natural implies that it is also immoral. We can also find reasons against thinking that our intuitions are a good guide to morality. Finally, we can think that taking risks is part of acting morally on a particular issue, and that we can take a different stance to the one that points out that morality is always a matter of opinion, and therefore there can be no debate about what is the right or wrong thing to do in a particular situation.